Welcome to the Made in Migration podcast, brought to you by Lawgration, the specialist law firm that helps navigate the complex world of Australian immigration and citizenship law. Here we'll talk about all things to do with migrating to Australia. We're going to learn, grow and be inspired together. Make sure you subscribe and let us be partners on your journey. You're listening to a Lawgration production. This podcast is intended for education and or entertainment purposes only. All content is current at the time of recording and subject to change without prior notice. While Lawgration is an incorporated legal practice, we are not aware of your personal circumstances, needs or goals, and information contained in this podcast should not be construed as legal, immigration or other advice. Before acting on any information in this podcast, you should always query whether it is relevant to your circumstances and consult an Australian immigration lawyer or registered migration agent. Peter Mayers is an independent writer and researcher. He serves as a contributing editor at Inside Story magazine, a member of the moderating team at the Crenlana Centre for Ethical Leadership, a fellow at the Centre for Policy Development, and an adjunct senior research fellow at Monash University School of Media, Film and Journalism. His latest book, No Place Like Home, Repairing Australia's Housing Crisis, was published in 2018. In June 2020, a related four-part series, Housing the Australian Nation, aired on ABC Radio National's eShot program. Peter is also the author of Not Quite Australian, How Temporary Migration is Changing the Nation and Borderline. In collaboration with Julianne Schultz, he co-edited a 2018 edition of Griffith's Review on Migration, Identity and Belonging titled Who We Are. From 1987 to 2011, Peter worked as a journalist and broadcaster with the ABC, where he presented national radio programs and served as a foreign correspondent. Later, he worked on urban policy as a Cities Fellow at the Grattan Institute. He has been affiliated with Crenlana since 2013, serving as lead moderator and program director for 2018 to 2022. Welcome, Peter.
Thanks very much for inviting me on your show.
It's an absolute pleasure. I'm wondering what inspired you to transition from journalism to academia?
Well, I haven't really transitioned entirely. I had a long career with the ABC for 25 years, and at the end of that time, I thought, well, let's see what else I can do. And I had always, in at least in the last 10 years or so of my career at the ABC, I had combined my broadcasting career with writing, not just journalistic articles, but also sort of public policy research. So I'd had an adjunct position at Swinburne University. I'd written my first book in 2001, which was about refugees and asylum seeker policy in Australia. So I guess I've had a dual track of doing some academic work, some public policy work and journalism. And I still write, as you mentioned in your intro, I write regularly for a small magazine called Inside Story and occasionally contribute to other outlets. So it's a kind of mix between journalism and public policy research, I suppose.
You've got a particular focus on migration and housing. I'm wondering where you developed the interest in those two fields.
Well, it began with migration, and it began in the early 1990s when I was presenting a program called Asia Pacific, an Asia Pacific Affairs program on Radio National. And that was the time, as people might know, that the Keating Labor government introduced mandatory detention for anyone who arrived in Australia by boat without a valid visa. So they had already been detaining people, but that was going to come up for challenge before the High Court because there was a group of Cambodians who were challenging their indefinite detention. And as the federal court was about to hand down its decision in that case, the Parliament rushed through legislation basically underpinning mandatory detention as a regime. So I was covering that story, reporting on that story, and the first, I suppose I thought it was a bit of a scoop when I interviewed a public official, an immigration department official live on air, and asked him whether people arriving by boat were being given advice as to their legal rights, that they had a right to claim asylum, they had a right to get legal advice, and I was told no, they weren't. They were deliberately not being told those things, which shocked me at the time. It doesn't shock me anymore because we've seen that kind of abuse of process, in my view, in all sorts of ways ever since. But at the time, and so I became interested in refugee policy, migration policy, and then I lived in Vietnam, worked in Vietnam for 2 years as a foreign correspondent for the ABC, and during that period, it was a time when a lot of let's use the term failed asylum seekers, that is, Vietnamese people, families who'd left Vietnam in the 80s as boat people, so-called, and who'd been then held in detention centres in places like Hong Kong and Malaysia and so on, but who had not been found to be in need of protection, had not been found to be refugees. And so under a comprehensive agreement, regional agreement, they were being returned to Vietnam. And so I did a foreign correspondence story on that and other stories, radio stories on that, talking to people who had spent often 10 years in detention and were coming back to Vietnam having missed out on a period of opening up and economic opportunity. So they were terribly moving personal stories, people who'd left trying to get a better life for themselves and their children and who had really missed the boat, so to speak, and ended up being returned, but had lost their jobs as teachers, had lost the opportunity to grab that initial chance to set up a small business as Vietnam was opening up and so on. So I just became very interested in that whole. I suppose what interests me about migration overall is as a journalist, there's always a very interesting personal story, individual stories to tell. And as a public policy, someone with interesting public policy, there's also the complexities of how do you create systems that are fair and fair to those individuals with their own personal stories and so on. So I found it very interesting. And when I returned from Vietnam, I was invited to pitch a book idea. Initially, I think the editor wanted me to write about Vietnam, but I ended up writing about refugees, and that coincided. I was writing about refugees as boat arrivals really surged in 1999, 2000, culminating in the Tampa affair in 2001.
That's super interesting. Clearly something that's very close to your heart and that you've devoted many years in your professional career to this space. In a recent article that you wrote, you mentioned that the system wasn't working for anyone in its current form. You alluded to the difficulties and the complexities involved in devising a system that works for the various stakeholders. As part of that, I want to move on to the topic of the government's migration strategy, which was released on the 11th of December last year. For those of our listeners who might not know, this document outlines a new vision for Australia's migration system with a policy road map containing 8 key actions and over 25 new policy commitments and areas for future reform. Now, it's almost 7 months on at the time of recording, and I'm wondering, is the migration strategy playing out as you anticipated, and are we on track to restore or strengthen migration's social license in this country?
I would say it's not on track as I would have hoped or anticipated. I mean, of course, the migration strategy was based, first of all, on an expert review of the migration program, which the government commissioned as soon as it was elected in May 2022, and I thought that review did a pretty good job, but its focus was entirely on skilled migration. So we should be clear that the government so far in its reform efforts is only focused on the skilled migration program and hasn't started looking at family migration, and that's something we might come back to because there's some big issues there. But a lot of the things the government has done already, has done a number of good things. I think, for example, raising what's called the TISMET, which is the minimum salary that you have to offer to someone who comes in on a temporary skilled worker visa. It hadn't been raised for 10 years under the coalition. And so we saw a lot of fairly low-paid jobs, people being brought in on fairly low-paid jobs and at risk of exploitation, particularly in hospitality and so on. So the government jumped up the minimum payment threshold to $70,000, which I thought was a good thing. It did other stuff like creating a pathway to permanent residency and therefore citizenship for New Zealanders. Again, a very good move in my view, because New Zealanders were caught in a kind of limbo of being able to live permanently in Australia but not become citizens unless they could jump through the skilled migration hoop, even though they'd built lives here and so on. So in that sense, I think the government started well, and it's now still coming up with a plan to revise the points test for skilled migration, which is, how people are assessed. They get certain points for good English, for their age, for their skills, their qualifications, work experience in Australia, and so on. Now, I think we wait to see what exactly the government does there. But the reason I think it's gone off track is, of course, we've since then also had the High Court decision. The High Court, of course, found that the indefinite detention of non-citizens was unconstitutional and unlawful. So the government had to release about 140 people from immigration detention. And that created, there was then that the opposition seized on that, even though it was a court decision, not a policy decision, seized on that to say the government was ill-prepared. And we've seen from sections of the media too a kind of moral panic around the idea that these people have been, these non-citizens have been released into the community. Now, in my view, there was nothing extraordinary. I thought it was a good decision by the High Court. People get released from custody every day who've committed crimes, and they release back into the community. The only difference in this case is that these are non-citizens. So, I think it's a challenging problem, but I think it shouldn't get the attention it's got. Or doesn't necessarily deserve the attention it's had in the public mind and in the media debates and so on. It's really been exploited, in my view, for political purposes, and it's distracted the government from the more longer-term immigration reform programs. Distracted the government, the bureaucracy, and we've seen both ministers, Home Affairs Minister Claire O'Neill and Immigration Minister Andrew Giles, under great pressure. People, and there have been missteps. I'm not suggesting there haven't been mistakes or whatever, but it's been, I think, a huge distraction from the longer-term project of rebuilding what was a broken migration system. And so, I think we haven't progressed as much as I would have liked to see.
Just on that, where does Ministerial Direction 110, it's just been issued on, I believe it was the 7th or the 8th of June. Where's the place for that in this particular conversation?
Well, it's a course correction. I'm not an immigration lawyer or migration agent, and I haven't looked at it closely, but it's a course correction. So we need to go back to the other direction, which was Ministerial Direction 99. And essentially that was telling, and this all goes to people who were removed from Australia, deported after criminal convictions. And often, under the previous government, very little weight was given to whether those people had strong ties to the Australian community. Under Direction 99, which was Andrew Giles' direction, further he directed public service to give greater weight to people's ties to Australia, as in deciding whether they should be kicked out of Australia or not. That resulted in some people getting visas who had serious criminal records, and some of whom have then gone on to commit further crimes. And so now we're seeing the government go back on that and put greater emphasis on community safety above and beyond ties to Australia. Now that sounds like, well, of course you'd put emphasis on community safety and so on. I get that. But what we're talking about here is often people who have spent the majority of their lives in Australia. Often they came here as children, but they're not citizens. Often they're New Zealanders, for example. So they are a product of, often these people are a product of Australian society. They've been through the Australian prison system. If that has failed to reform them, then that is our problem, not New Zealand's problem or Malaysia's problem or wherever it may be. So I think there is place for greater consideration of someone's ties to Australia, both in the sense of they may have children here, they may have close relatives here, they may have no relationships back in their homeland because they left that place when they were 2 or 3 years old. And so while, community safety, of course, is very important, I think we also need to think about what is our responsibility as a nation for people who have essentially grown up in Australia and who have committed crimes and been through the prison system, if they are not reformed, then that is our problem, not someone else's. So that's my view, but it's not one that sells well in newspapers, which is much easier to say, this is a foreigner, they committed a crime, kick them out. It's a much simpler approach, and it's generally a very superficial approach that you tend to get.
On that social license, Peter, if you were to sort of sum it up in a line or two, where do we stand? Are we restoring it, or are we strengthening it?
Well, I think the other factor going on here that we have to acknowledge is the massive spike in net overseas migration. Okay, so we have the permanent migration program, which is fixed at 195,000, 185,000, I think it is this current year. But actually, what's important in terms of migration numbers is how many people enter the country every year and how many people leave for long-term stays. So putting aside tourists, we've got people coming, international students, working holiday makers, temporary skilled workers, New Zealanders, all of whom come and may stay for 12 months or more. And what we've seen post-COVID is a huge spike in arrival numbers. So we had net overseas migration, so the number of people who arrived minus the number of people who departed long-term. We had net overseas migration at record levels of 595,000 or something like that, 565,000. I may not have the figure right, but it's very high. And that has then generated, again, a kind of lot of media coverage of, borders out of control, migration out of control. But again, we need to see this in context. The context is we had COVID, the borders closed, student numbers in Australia halved, more than half. We went from 650,000 students in Australia to less than half that number. No one was arriving. So actually net overseas migration went negative for the first time. We had more people leaving than arriving. And so if we hadn't had COVID and we smoothed out the arrivals, we'd be in a similar place today in terms of population as would have been predicted in 2019 by the coalition government. The problem is we've had a huge drop in migration and then a sudden surge back. And it's that surge back that has created the problems. And this might bring us to the housing market, because it's a huge number of people arriving in a very short period of time. And that is going to be hard for any country, any economy. And it's very visually evident in big cities like Melbourne and Sydney.
It's a great segue to talk about our housing, as you sort of suggested, a topic which you've spent many years researching and writing about. It seems to be the quintessential dinner table topic in this country. It's even got a place within the Australian psyche, so much so that we refer to the desire for every Australian family to own their home as the great Australian dream. Recent debate about housing has seen it inextricably linked to migration, though. For a bit of context, under existing rules, foreigners are generally not allowed to purchase established houses in Australia. Temporary residents can apply to purchase one established property for their primary residence, or if they plan to redevelop the property to add to housing stock. Treasury data indicates that a very small proportion of properties are purchased by foreign residents in Australia. In terms of the rental market, according to research undertaken by the Grattan Institute, for every 100,000 extra migrants, rents rise by around 1%. Now, given that around 60% of visas under the permanent migration program are granted to migrants who are already in Australia, how much impact will cutting the permanent migration program really have on housing supply, Peter?
A lot to unpack there, but basically the permanent migration program will have very little impact on the number of people coming to Australia. So as you said, something like 60% of permanent places go to people who are already here on various types of temporary visas. So much more important than the size of whether you cut the permanent migration from 185,000 to 145,000, as I think the opposition is proposing. Much more important is what happens in terms of the number of long-term temporary migrants. So international students, New Zealanders, working holiday makers, and temporary skilled workers. There's no caps on those numbers. Government can't make them higher or lower. It depends on a whole set of conditions. So it depends on how strong is the Australian economy. Is our unemployment low? More people are likely to come if unemployment's low. If we're in recession, fewer people will come. Because there won't be jobs for them to come to. So temporary migration goes up and down with economic cycles, business cycles, and so on. But as I was saying earlier, because of COVID and the post-COVID catch-up, we've seen a massive short-term spike. And I should point out the previous coalition government also put incentives in place to get students back, like rebates on their visa fees, or allowing them to work 40 hours a week, and so on. And the current government is, reining in a lot of those things, and also cracking down on colleges that are not high quality, dodgy kind of colleges. So there's a lot going on there. But I think if we look in the longer term, Australia is a high net migration country. We do have a high level of overseas migration, and that contributes about 60% or 70% of our population growth is from migration. Over time, our housing has generally kept pace, more or less, with that rise in immigration. We've built, build housing at a similar rate, slightly faster than migration. And we can see two interesting facts. So while we know since 2000, house prices have risen much faster than wages, three times the rate of wages. So we've got this mismatch between house prices and wages. House prices have gone through the roof. But interestingly, rents haven't risen much faster than wages. Now, rents are arguably a better indicator of the true demand for housing, because as most immigrants who come to Australia, initially, most will rent. They're not going to buy houses straight away, especially if they're on a temporary visa. There'll be a few, like you mentioned, who may be very wealthy, who can afford to buy a house to live in. Most will simply rent initially. So the fact that rents didn't rise as much as house prices doesn't mean rents are affordable for everyone, but that's another question. But rents didn't rise nearly as steeply over the past 20 years as house prices, suggests we've done a reasonable job of keeping those two things in population and housing in reasonable proportions. But again, we come back to this post-COVID spike in migration, sudden jump in numbers. Now that has put real pressure on the rental market, and we have seen a spike in rents since the borders reopened. It's one of the factors involved there. And so we've got a lag. It'll take a while for the construction sector and so on to catch up with that, because construction lags population growth, and also we've got a downturn in business cycle now for all the construction industry, labour shortages, costs of supplies going up, and so on. So it's a mixed picture. It's one of the things we see as a desire to have simple answers to complex questions. Cut migration, fix the housing prices, and it's just not that straightforward. It's much more complicated than that. But there is now a legitimate question, I guess, is, well, should we have caps on temporary migration in the same way as we have caps on the permanent migration program? And that's now under discussion.
That's interesting. I think it was December 2023, you wrote in an article that, quote, as long as we rely on international students to fund our higher education system and backpackers to pick our produce, temporary migration will continue at a high level. Now, your observations point to deeper structural issues about our labour market and our broader economy, and attempting to solve those issues would likely involve overcoming some serious political hurdles, as we're sort of essentially discussing. Now, if it's seriously believed that changing the migration intake is the best place to start when it comes to solving housing supply, would it not make much more sense to look at the temporary migration program, which in terms of size absolutely dwarfs the permanent program? Or is that the point at which the potential electoral consequences of our economic realities become perhaps too difficult to manage?
I think that, this is what now both sides of politics are saying, that they want to put a cap on the number of international students coming to Australia. I suspect they won't need to employ those caps, because what we're going to see happen is, as a result, that surge in post-COVID returns of international students will stop anyway. We'll also see if the government is successful in cracking down on lower quality colleges that are essentially operating as visa fronts, visa factories to enable people to work in Australia. Well, that will reduce numbers. If the government is successful in overcoming the backlog of appeal cases before the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. So what we've got also, another problem we've bequeathed to this government by the previous one, is a lot of people applying for protection visas, as refugees, who have very low quality or low chance of success. And appears that there's a degree of organisation here where people are being encouraged to apply for, people who arrive on, a tourist visa are then encouraged to apply for protection as a refugee, because that then grants them a work visa while they're waiting for their case to be heard. And then they can appeal that to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. And again, they can work while that's waiting to be heard. That can last years. So you can get essentially a work visa that lasts for years. Now, again, there appears to be rorting in the system. And the quickest way to deal with that is to actually overcome the backlog of cases. So someone who lodges an appeal is heard very quickly, and there's no benefit then in...
Sure. Disincentivizes, yeah. Sure.
So there's perverse incentives built in the system. So there's a whole lot of practical things to overcome. But going back to students, if the government is, it's raised the English language threshold required to become an international student in Australia, it's increased the amount of money you need to show in savings before you can come. All this is going to have a dampening effect on the number of students who come. And they've changed the post-study work visa to make it slightly less attractive than it was. All these things, I suspect, will reduce the numbers anyway, and the caps may not be necessary because things will fall back to a more normal, a more expected level. The point I would make is the problems in our housing sector are not new, right? They go back 20, 30 years. The mismatch, as I said, between house prices and wages began in about 2000. So perhaps population is not the problem we need to fix. Migration is not the problem we need to fix. Perhaps the problem is a whole lot of incentives built into the property market that encourage overinvestment in housing and speculation in housing and so on. So that's a whole different conversation.
And perhaps it's a good time to go to a bit of modern history then. The Commonwealth Housing Commission was established in 1943 at the height of World War II by Prime Minister John Curtin. The year before that, in 1942, John Curtin appointed Ben Chifley to head a new Department of Post-War Reconstruction, which would plan and coordinate Australia's reconstruction. Of course, Chifley later became Australia's 16th Prime Minister and relevantly negotiated housing agreements with the states to construct new dwellings to be offered for rent. And Sir Robert Menzies inherited the 10-year Commonwealth State Housing Agreement, and home ownership rates under his leadership jumped dramatically, rising from about 50% at the end of World War II to over 70% in 1966. Interestingly, that was an era of mass migration for Australia, and remarkably, housing stocks still outstripped population growth by about 10%. Now, were we just better at picking people with the right skills back then, or was there some other secret sauce to all of this, Peter?
No, I think it wasn't so much the people who came, and we have a much higher skilled migration program today than we did then. But I think it was more that the government saw itself as an active and important player in the housing market. So the government, the initial problem, we had very serious housing problems in the pre-war period, and that was investigated and exposed and, talked about. And the government was rebuilding after World War II. It was rebuilding. It wanted also to open up to migration beyond Britain. As we know, we saw mass migration in the post-war period. And we had returning soldiers who needed to be, honoured and treated appropriately, and they needed to have homes. So we saw a mass program of house building where the government played a central role, both largely in the Commonwealth level, providing finance to the states so the states could build public housing as it was then. And a lot of it was public housing for rent. And today we think of public housing being for the poorest of the poor, but broadly public housing was for a range of people on a range of incomes, lower incomes, but working people. So I grew up in Adelaide. The whole city of Elizabeth was built by the South Australian Housing Trust And it was built next to where eventually Holden opened its factories, and it was built to attract industry and investment to that northern suburb of Adelaide. So you had an integrated process of industry policy and housing policy and migration policy working together, with the government, state and federal, knowing they had a fundamental role to play to make sure that housing supply was there. They also built a lot of housing that was then sold. I mean, a lot of people bought government-built housing, but it was operating on a different model from the commercial model we see today. So I think there was a recognition then that the government had an important role to play, and that's what I would say has been lost in the current period. I mean, again, since coming to office, the Albanese government has stepped back in. It has upped the amount of investment, Commonwealth investment in housing, but it's still well short in proportional terms of what it was in that post-war period. So I think, if we really wanted, where's the supply problem? Like, there's a lot of people in Australia who have two homes, right? They have a home down the coast and they have a home in the city, for example, or they, so a lot of people live in big homes and with far more bedrooms than they need. So the problem is not just one of the supply of housing, but the distribution. Also, it's distribution. So there's a whole lot of issues here. But the real supply problem is for people on low incomes. They're the ones who can't find housing they can afford. And that's where that's where there's a role for public investment, to build housing and rent it out at a price that people can afford who are on low to moderate incomes.
Just a few quick stats on those things that you mentioned. Now, apparently about 76.8% of homes in Australia have surplus bedrooms, interestingly, according to an ABS survey on income and housing. I understand 32.5% of houses in Australia have at least one bedroom spare, 31.8% have two bedrooms spare, 12.5% have three or more spare, and it's presumed that the majority of spare bedrooms reside with older homeowners. So we have some stock that might be unleashed if the right policy incentives were perhaps at play. But is that not a difficult political conversation, Peter?
It's a very difficult political conversation. And when I talk about things like this, people say, you want to kick people out of the homes they've lived in all their lives, and and people need their spare rooms for when the grandchildren stay. And I get all that stuff. That's absolutely true. But 3 spare bedrooms is a lot of spare bedrooms. So, there are a lot, and I wouldn't say it's just older people, it's also the wealthy. The wealthy are more likely to have more spare bedrooms than people on lower incomes. So really it's a question of fairness and distribution. Maybe if I'm wealthy enough to have 4 spare bedrooms or whatever, or maybe I should pay a higher level of tax in some form so that money can then go into creating housing for someone else. Or maybe there's a disincentive in Australia to downsize your housing as you age, because we have a stamp duty, right? So there's a big transaction cost if you sell a home and buy, even if you're buying a smaller one, there's still it's sort of, you feel like, well, I'm paying, $30,000 in stamp duty for nothing. I may as well stay where I am. So if we shifted the way we tax housing from stamp duty paid when you buy a home to a broad-based property tax that you pay more like your council rates year by year, it would change the incentive structures. And then I think, well, why am I living in this big house and paying this property tax when I could shift to something smaller and pay less property tax, and I wouldn't have to, I wouldn't have the house that's too big for me now. I'm getting older. I don't want a big house that's going to have too much work to do and all the rest of it.
It goes to, I think, the fundamental question of what type of society do we want to see, etc. So it's really deep level questions. And there's been recent attempts, of course, with negative gearing, etc. in 2019 election, and going back to the 80s with, I think, Keating tried to remove it and brought it back. And so it's a real deep question. I mean, perhaps back to the original idea of more sort of government-led initiatives in terms of housing, where do you place the build-to-rent sector in that conversation? Does it have a pivotal role to play in terms of solving Australia's housing woes? And if you can just talk a bit about the role of perhaps the private sector.
So just to explain what build to rent is. So mostly in Australia, when you see apartments built, they're they're built for sale. So, it's strata titled and buyers come along and buy an apartment as an investment property or to live in for themselves. Now, that kind of building has a whole lot of sort of hidden costs. There's huge marketing costs. There's very big finance costs because the developer has to sell 70% of the homes in advance off the plan in order to get the finance secured, because then the banks think, okay, this is a safe investment, and so on. Build to rent operates on a different model. The idea is you build an apartment block and all the apartments in it are for rent permanently. They're not for sale. And so the developer is not interested in the premium on selling the properties. They're interested in the long-term return, rental return. And this changes the incentives. So, for example, that means the developer has an incentive to produce an energy-efficient building, because as the owner, they're going to go on paying the costs of maintaining the energy within that building, not the apartments. People will pay their own energy in the apartments, but lifts and all that sort of stuff. They have an interest. That means they have an interest in really high-quality, durable materials because they own the building, and if something breaks, they're going to have to fix it. And we've seen all the apartment defects that happen in the build-to-sell sector. You would hope that would be less likely in the build-to-rent, because if I'm going to own and rent out this building for 50 years, I want to make sure it lasts 50 years, right? So I think build-to-rent is a really important initiative. I don't think it is a silver bullet or anything like that. There's no silver bullets here. There's only a set of different, mix of policy mixes we can have. But it's the advantage of build-to-rent is generally premium rent. It's not for low-income housing, but it can create a different option for people within the rental market, and everything that adds to supply and the diversity of supply, in my view, is welcome. But build-to-rent is disadvantaged by negative gearing capital gains tax rules, which are designed to support small-scale investors. So we do have a mismatch between the tax regime and the land tax regime and build-to-rent, and the governments need to work their way through that. But we are seeing build-to-rent come on now, and I think it's a welcome addition to the range and diversity. It's much more common in other countries, the range and diversity of housing options that we have. It needs to be well regulated, of course, but that's true of every housing sector.
Peter, now on to briefly perhaps the other considerations or the flow-ons of the migration program. I'll just draw your attention to a particular investigation that was undertaken by the Federal Government Centre for Population and the OECD in 2001, which found that migrants typically boost the labour productivity of Australian-born workers. Now, we know that migration delivers more than just, of course, economic benefits. For example, it's widely accepted that migration helps offset our ageing population. But focusing purely on the economics of migration, are we typically better off because of it on a per capita basis?
Look, I think in the long term, yes, though maybe not always in the short term. So it partly depends on how, at the moment we've had very sluggish economic growth and high levels of migration. And so that means in per capita terms, we're probably going backwards when you spread out, wealth over every person in the population. But the point you made is an important one. It depends also how the migration program is organised. If the migration program has an emphasis on skills, as Australia's does, then you're bringing in skills that to fill jobs that would otherwise be hard to fill in the Australian economy, and that should boost productivity. Those skills are passed on, are shared. You see people then, higher level employment opportunities opening up because you've got more skilled workers coming into enterprises and so on. So I think overall migration can benefit everyone, and there are all sorts of ways, as you say, not just economically, but in terms of diversity of ideas and social mix and so on. It does slow the ageing of our population if you have an emphasis on youth, as we do in Australia as well. But the population will still age over time, and we still need to factor that in. And at some point, the world this is much more longer term thinking, but the global population is going to peak and fall. And one thing we don't know how to do is to manage without population growth. So it's hard to know what Australia's economy, what a growing Australian economy would look like without population growth. I think we have relied fairly heavily on population as a driver of economic growth. And so, it's not either or in my view. I mean, I think as you say, skills add to productivity in Australia. They create jobs, create opportunity. I welcome the diversity that migration brings to Australia and all the excitement, cultural richness, all that brings. But in the long term, the question of how we transition to a different type of economy that isn't reliant on high levels of immigration, that's going to be a longer term question that Australia has to come to terms with, I think.
On a final note, how do you reconcile the tension between advocating for a rational migration policy and addressing the concerns of citizens who genuinely feel that they're losing out with the current levels of migration?
Yeah, look, I acknowledge that people are losing out and they feel that migration is to blame. And they're told that migration is to blame often. So we're told that congestion on the streets and in public transport is, migrants are the problem. We're told that house prices, migrants are the problem. So it's, as I said earlier, it's very easy to offer simple solutions to complex problems. But at the same time, we do need to take people's everyday concerns seriously. People do feel housing. People are experiencing housing stress. Housing is too expensive. Rents are too high. There's not enough rental properties to go around. Our services, aged care, healthcare are not necessarily keeping up with demand. They'd be even worse, of course, if we didn't have overseas doctors and nurses and all kinds of healthcare professionals coming in to staff them, particularly in regional and remote Australia. But so I think, for me, I think that we need to shift the focus from migration as a driver of all these problems and ask, well, what about, simple questions of fairness? So if we go back to housing, we're always talking about a housing crisis. But for anyone like me who bought a house, in an earlier period, there's no housing crisis. There's a housing bonanza. My house prices my value of my home's gone through the roof. So why do I deserve that increase in the value of my home? Not really. I just happen to be generationally lucky. I happen to have been able to buy a home when it was only, let's say, 3.5 times average earnings. I'm not particularly wealthy, but I'm comfortably off. So I've benefited from that. Many of my generation have. Many richer Australians, wealthier Australians have benefited greatly from the property boom. I think it's time to share some of that wealth around and use some of that wealth to fund the services Australians want and need. And so, to me, that brings us back to tax reform. And you said before, these are politically difficult conversations. Well, tax reform is just as hard as immigration because no one wants to pay, or very few people want to pay more tax. But actually, there are those of us in Australia benefiting from generous property tax systems, generous superannuation systems, and so on, who could easily afford to pay a bit more and share our wealth with those younger and less wealthy Australians who, and to build the sorts of social services we think we need. And I think that would, if we actually gave people the support they needed, then they would feel more comfortable about migration because they wouldn't feel that they were suffering, from such ill effects.
Peter Mayers, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on. Thank you so much for your time.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you for your questions.
You've been listening to a Lawgration production. This podcast is intended for education and/or entertainment purposes only. All content is current at the time of recording and subject to change without prior notice. While Lawgration is an incorporated legal practice, we are not aware of your personal circumstances, needs, or goals, and information contained in this podcast should not be construed as legal, immigration, or other advice. Before acting on any information in this podcast, you should always query whether it is relevant to your circumstances and consult an Australian immigration lawyer or registered migration agent.